I do not like to worry you with this, but my husband has strictly advised me to let all of my relatives know of my breakdown. I have made out my will, and I have left all that I have to my husband. This is only natural, as I love my husband. Welcome to the Extraordinary Stories podcast. Hey, hello, welcome. How are you? Are you good? Are you well? I hope so. I'm good. I'd like to say a big shout out to all of the new Twitter, Instagram and Facebook followers. To those who are saying very nice, very kind things about the podcast online. Thanks very much. If you haven't shared the podcast with others yet, then what are you waiting for? Go ahead. Tell your friends if you haven't already. Share the podcast with anyone who likes a fucked up story. Anyone who's into true crime. Anyone who's into just things that are a little bit weird. Let them know. This week's story, I think it's the oldest case that I've ever covered. And the reason I picked it is because there's some really interesting elements. And it points us in the direction really of how evidence is brought into court, or was first introduced into court in a really interesting way. And it talks about the importance of pathology when trying to prove that someone is guilty. Okay, let's go. Okay, the central character in this story is a man called George Joseph Smith. An absolute bastard of a man. It's really the only way to describe him. He was described as well-dressed, sociopathic, a charmer, a criminal, and a cunt. I added that last one. That's not really how he was described, but that's my opinion on him. If you look up George Joseph Smith, and you just Google search an image of him, hilariously, he looks like, we're talking, this story takes place in about 1910. He looks like every man of that time. If you just picture what you think a man in 1910 in England looked like, he has the classic moustache, you know, the one that curls up at the end, you know, the hat, that sort of bowler type hat that those men would wear, and the images are always in black and white. He's just got the classic 1910 Englishman look. So, his early life, he was the son of an insurance agent, and he was born in Bethnal Green in London. He was sent to a reformatory at Gravesend at the age of 9, and he later served a little time in prison for swindling and theft. In 1896, he was imprisoned for 12 months for persuading a woman to steal from her employers. This is something that will become important to his story later. He used the proceeds from the woman stealing for him to open a baker's shop in Leicester. The baker's shop was pretty much his last brush with any sort of legitimate work. He went on to make money in the most devious and the most horrible ways that you possibly can. Now, it's a really bad sign if you're 9 years old and you're already a thief and you're already being sent to a house for unruly kids. It's not to say that you can't come through that process and you can't come through that system. You absolutely can. But George, well, he didn't come through it properly, and we'll see that as his life unfolds. In 1898, he married Caroline Thornhill, but he married her under an alias. He told her his name was Oliver Love. Why another name, I hear you ask? Well, you'll find out. This becomes very, very much his pattern. So they moved to London, where she worked as a maid for a number of employers, and during this time she was stealing for her husband. She was eventually caught and sentenced to 12 months in prison. On her release, fuming, fucking raging that she had gone to prison when she'd actually been stealing for her husband, she incriminated him, and he was in prison for 2 years in January 1901. On his release, his wife, whose then name was Mrs. Love, fled to Canada. Smith then went back to his other wife, cleared out her savings, and left. Smith was a man who liked to marry lots and lots of women and then just leave them and move on to the next. Now, it's unknown how many women he actually treated in this way in the years of his life. George was a bigamist with an obsession for money, but he was so much worse than just that. Bigamy obviously is a huge part of the story I'm discussing here, and it's awful. Bigamy, and quite rightly, it's punished quite heavily. Now, I'm talking about the kind of bigamy where someone marries someone, doesn't already know that they're married to someone else, and then extorts money out of them or leads a double life and lets that person think that they're married to them only. As you would naturally assume when you marry someone, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, they're probably married to someone else as well. In the UK last year, there were 650 people arrested for bigamy. I think that's shocking that 650 people are still at it. I tried to research statistics in the rest of the world, and I couldn't really find anything. When I went into looking for Australia and America and the rest of Europe, I just kept coming up against figures for polygamy, which polygamy takes it in a whole different direction. It's not really what I'm talking about in this episode. I'm not talking about the people who have a faith where you can have 3 wives. That's absolutely entirely different from bigamy in my eyes. Bigamy's where you marry someone and you pretend that you're not already married to someone else. There was actually an amazing Channel 4 documentary on recently, and I think it was called My 3 Wives is the name of it. I'll find the name of it. I'll post it. That is an incredible. It centres around a Mormon family in Utah, and it is absolutely wonderful because I went into that documentary thinking, well, I don't really know much about people who live a polygamous lifestyle. I don't really know a great deal about it, but I'm not sure from the outset that I particularly enjoy the idea of it. By the second episode, I'd sort of changed my mind, and I was like, I don't know if I think this is actually quite a good way of life. I was looking at all the people in it. I was looking at the man, and I was looking at his 3 wives, and I was thinking, actually, I think they're all doing quite well out of this. Everyone's benefiting, and it seems to be working. By the end of the 3rd episode, I'd come full circle, and I was back to thinking, no, don't think that is. And then I was left with lots and lots of questions after it. So it's still one of those ones in my mind that's not, I'm not dead against it. I'm not dead for it. But I also just think, I don't know. I think I'd need to spend a wee bit more time looking at it and thinking about it and maybe seeing examples of it. I think that's what changed my mind, is actually seeing on this documentary, because it follows these people over, I think it's a year of their lives, 2 years of their life, something like that. So you actually get to see what effect having 3 wives does to the man, what that does to the first wife, the second wife, the new 3rd wife, how they're all affected over a period of time. And that's kind of, their different perspectives make it really interesting. Anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent there about polygamy, but only really because, as I said, I tried to research bigamy, and I just kept coming up against polygamy, which is an entirely different thing. I became aware of George Joseph Smith because of a brilliant documentary that's looking at cases which changed the course of how we try things in court, or how people are arrested, and this is one of the cases that they bring to look at. So in 1915, a trial for George Joseph Smith, the bigamist, took place in London, but the charge wasn't bigamy. The charge was murder. And so here's where the story begins. George Joseph Smith, he had no real fixed location to call home, so he moved around England all the time. In 1910, he meets a woman named Bessie Munday. Now Bessie, she is absolutely vital to this story later on. Bessie Munday and George, they married in 1910, the year that they met. In fact, they met and they married within just a few days. Now for 1910, that was fast. That was some seriously fast meeting someone and marrying them. He was on a mission. He was known to be really good at courting women. that old phrase, courting. He was known to be good at courting women. He was smart, he was well dressed, he was presentable, and in this documentary, the one word that they use, which I think just is so interesting, they say, above all that, he was plausible, which is, it's a great description of someone. They also say, such spinsters were perfect prey for Smith. He was a smooth talking gentleman with a slim, muscular physique and a penchant for flashy gold rings and brightly coloured bow ties. I mean, that's great. Give me a man with a bow tie and I am in. That's it. I must have been what was doing it for those women, was the bow ties. Each woman that he met, he persuaded them very quickly that they were the love of his life. And so that's why the marriages were so fast, because he would meet them and he would say, I've never met anyone like you. I absolutely have to make you my wife. So within days, him and Bessie, they were in love and they were married. But she had no idea he was already married to 4 other women at this point. Now, this is only really the start of the madness of what's about to come with him. I wondered when I was thinking about this, it doesn't really say it in this and I can't really find it written down anywhere. I wonder if sex was a big part of this. I mean, I can only imagine it can be. It's not, I'll come on to this in a second, but it's not very flattering how some of the women that George ended up marrying are described. Sometimes they're described as a woman who was on the shelf. I mean, thank fuck we have come such a long way since 1910 that anybody would ever be described as on the shelf. I mean, it's a horrible way to talk about anybody. But I'm imagining that these women that he preyed upon were perhaps women who hadn't really had any men in their life. They hadn't really had a sexual experience. And so I'm thinking he probably did use that in order to, you know what it's like. You have sex with someone, you can very quickly, very, very, very quickly have an emotional bond with that person at the same time. And being the sociopath that he was, he would have known that. He would have understood exactly what he was doing. And it probably helped him in terms of who he was preying upon at the time. I mean, he's a man who, I don't think he actually had any love for any of the women. He just literally was using them for his own gain. At the time, he used a variety of names. Bessie didn't know him by George, which was his real name. She knew him as Henry. Well, it's said that Bessie was easily led and gullible. And her family said she was a lovely girl, but she was easily preyed upon. So she was flattered. She was incredibly flattered by his attentions. Now, Bessie had a trust fund, and it had in it £2,500. That was a fucking fortune at that time. That was some amount of money. Now, this trust fund, it wasn't with Bessie, it was actually with her uncle. So, George says to her, right, write to your uncle and ask for the money to be released. So she does. But the uncle was suspicious. He said, no, I'm not going to do that because I think something is not right with this man that you've married. Something's not right in the fact that you've got married so quickly. Good instincts from the uncle. Very good instincts. Always trust your fucking instincts. They're your guide. Even if people think you're mad, your instincts are sometimes the best thing you've got. So the uncle says no, but Bessie was able to access some money. So he gets from her £140. Again, that would have been an absolute fortune at that time. And once he's got the £140, he vanishes. He's gone. Goes, Bessie, not a clue where he is, gone. She then receives a letter, and the letter says, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving you." He lies to her and he says, "I've contracted an STD, a sexually transmitted disease." Total lies. He has not contracted anything like that at all. He just wanted that £140. Poor Bessie was heartbroken. She went to bed for months and months. She lay in bed and she refused to leave. So, how was he able to do this is one of the massive kind of questions here. How is he able to commit bigamy? Well, in those days, identity was quite hard to prove. It was really easy. If you wanted to change your name, it didn't really take much. You could kind of just do it. Yeah, it was piss easy to kind of just go to a new town, have a new name. All you really had to do if you were going to marry someone was you just gave a notice for a wedding. You could write a false name on it. That was fairly easy. So he moved around the country completely undetected, because everywhere he went he would just change his name. Women's rights at this time, I mean, it's fucking shocking. Any woman who had any level of money, so like Bessie had money, they weren't allowed to actually be in control of that money. It was always a man in their family who was in charge of it. And if they were bringing money into the family, the man immediately was able to control what happened with that money. I mean, fuck. That is really bad. But that was the times, and again, thank God, we're not there anymore. Horrible. Around 1908 to 1910, something happened here for George. He went on a spree of marrying, getting money, and leaving women. At this point, I think it was 1910, he had 8 different wives. He'd never returned to any of these women. He would marry them, get a bit of money, and go. But he returned to Bessie. So she's had her heart broken. She's been in bed with depression. Comes back. Why? Because she's got more fucking money to give. Because he just wants the rest of the money. So 2 years after he'd written her that horrible letter saying, "Oh, I've got an STD," he comes back. And he's incredibly charming. And she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he'd had an STD, but that it was fine now. And that actually, deep down, he did love her. And so she says, "That's fine. We can live our lives. We can be husband and wife at this time again." I mean, poor Bessie. I hate that women had no autonomy at this time. I hate that, she was she was just stuck in a position where that's what she had to do. So, only one day after being reunited, George says, "Okay, let's go to your solicitors. Let's write a letter to your family, and let's say that we're back together. And you must let your family know I am a really good guy." And here is the absolute kick in the balls. He persuades Bessie at this point to hand over another £140. Now, alarm bells should have been going off. They should have been so loud and so clear, but they weren't. So, she gives him the money. And then he says, "I think we should get out of here and we should start a new life miles away from this town." And she goes along with it. So they quickly move to a seaside town, and using Bessie's money, they buy a new property, but she starts to fall ill. So he takes her along to Dr. French, great name, and he says, "Right, Dr. French, she's had a fit." Again, terrible idea of women's rights. Bessie's not allowed to actually say in the doctor's surgery what's wrong with her. The man gets to describe the symptoms. So he says to the doctor, "She, my wife, has had a fit." And the doctor goes, "Okay, that's fine. I'll make a note of that. We'll give her some medication." Okay. Bessie writes a letter to her family and it says, "I do not wish to worry you like this, but my husband has strictly advised me to let all of my relatives know of my breakdown and my illness. I have made out my will and I have left all of it to my husband. This is only natural as I love my husband. He was such a psycho that he'd actually convinced her that she was having another breakdown. She wasn't having another breakdown. That was not happening for her. But he was messing with her brain and making her think that she was having a breakdown. Fucking terrible. So, in their home on Saturday the 13th of July, George and Bessie are in the house, and George says to Bessie, like a good caring husband, do you want me to fill a bath for you? So she says, yeah, that would be lovely. Now it's one of those old fashioned, one of those like really old fashioned tin baths, the ones that would take forever probably to fill. You'd probably have to go and collect water a million times just to get enough water to have a bath in. So Bessie gets into the bath. 1 hour later, a doctor is called, and Bessie is found in the following state. Her legs are hung over the edge of the bath, and her head is under the water. The doctor pronounces Bessie dead there and then. There's not a single mark on her body. So Dr. French, him again, he says, no need for a post-mortem. It wasn't needed. She'd clearly slipped under the water and she was unable to pull herself up, and therefore she drowned. Now, no suspicion fell at this point on George, and he claimed the thousands and thousands of pounds that Bessie had. So he takes Bessie's money and off he goes to Bristol. Bristol's about an hour outside of London. So in Bristol he has a wife, of course he does, one of the 8. He has a wife here called Edith. Edith was described as a strong woman. She would put up with the fact that he was away an awful lot of the time, that she hardly ever saw him, because he explained this away by saying that he worked abroad. So he would say to her, I have to go to, Australia for 6 months. I have to go here. And so she absolutely believed that. I think this is really creepy and really gross. When he arrived in Bristol, he gave her some clothing, which she was delighted to receive. The clothing was actually Bessie's clothing. So his dead wife's clothing he'd actually given to this other wife. Horrible. With the money he had, he started a couple of business ventures, but they were total shit because he was a shit businessman. He kept losing money. I think it was property. I think that's what he was... Yeah, it's not really important to the story, but I think he was putting money into property and then losing it. So he still had a bit of Bessie's cash kind of hanging about. And once more, he fucks off. He leaves Edith. He says, I'm away off to work abroad. And he goes in search of a new wife. So he moves away and he meets Alice. Now, Alice was the youngest of all of his wives. She's described as attractive and from a good family. But Alice had a secret. Alice's secret was that she had an STD. She had gonorrhea. Now, I don't know if in those days, I don't know what the gonorrhea treatment in those days were. I don't know if it was like really, I don't know if it was I can't imagine it was something that was life-threatening, although maybe 1910, 1912, maybe it was something that was life-threatening. Anyway, it certainly was not acceptable for a woman to have gonorrhea. So she was, again, this put her in a very vulnerable position. Now, George realised she didn't have a lot of money, but she had some. She had some money. Her father was apparently looking after about £300 that Alice had managed to save. So he says to Alice, okay, well, why don't you take out a life insurance policy? And then when we're man and wife, that means that I'll be protected. And so she does it. Oh, fuck. He married Alice very quickly, and they decide that they're going to honeymoon in Blackpool. Blackpool's a little town in the north of England, an amazing little place. If you've never been, give it a go. The hotel that they book into isn't necessarily fancy for their honeymoon, but it's got something that Smith needs: a bath. So, a couple of weeks after they're married, he decides, as a treat for his wife, his new bride, he's going to run her a bath. So after an hour, she's been in the bath. He calls the local doctor. The doctor arrives and guess what he finds? Alice was dead, and the doctors say there were no suspicious circumstances. So though the doctor doesn't see anything suspicious, Alice's family do. They arrive in Blackpool. They're not necessarily there to point the finger at George, but they just... yeah, something doesn't sit right with them. The speed of the marriage and the fact that she took out a life insurance policy, it's giving them room to question things. When I was reading through this, I stopped at this point because I thought, this really interests me. I mean, okay, obviously, so yes, I'm doing a podcast which largely covers true crime, which largely covers things that have, happened in the last 100 years that are insane, that are crazy, stories that we can't quite believe. But I think we're exposed now to so many different things. If you go on to any of these like channels higher up your skybox, you head up there to those things, you're going to find every type of killing, every type of murder, every type of theft, every type of everything crime-wise under the sun. So I suppose it takes less and less and less to shock us now in 2017. And something like this, you'd be thinking, well, okay, that looks suspicious. It looks suspicious that she took out life insurance. It looks suspicious that she's dead very quickly. But I don't suppose in those days, actually, maybe that wasn't a thing. Maybe people just didn't really think that way. I think it's a lot to do with actually how people's brains nowadays are wired. Maybe we're just more actually aware of it. Maybe we're just more open to it because we kind of know the horrors of it, because we've lived through some of the worst serial killers in the world. We've lived through some of the biggest atrocities in the world. Maybe we're a bit numbed to it, and so if you hear a man's wife has drowned in a bath, my immediate reaction is suspicion. And I don't know if that's necessarily a healthy place to be in life. I don't know, that's just one of those things I sort of grapple with sometimes, is do I look at everything and see it as a true crime? Do I look at every person and no, I don't look at every person and see them as a criminal. That would be a fucking lie if I said that. But I will always look sometimes. Yeah, I sometimes will look for the conspiracy, or I sometimes will look for the thing where I go, something doesn't... I suppose it's back to what I said about instincts earlier on. I just sometimes look at things and go, it doesn't sit right with me. Those two people just do not sit well with me, and I wonder if that's just because I spend so much time investigating these really weird, fucked up stories, or maybe actually we're just overexposed to those types of things. I don't know. Anyway, sorry, back to the story. A post-mortem would probably have helped here, but it wasn't carried out. In these days, a post-mortem would only really be carried out if the death was considered to be incredibly suspicious, and this wasn't. So at this point, I looked up drowning in a bath. I mean, it's just horrific. This is the process. The lungs will expand with water, which fills them up with water. You can no longer breathe. The body, however, tries to make the same movements of breathing, but all that's happening is you're taking in more and more water. So drowning is really hard to prove, even forced drowning. So it's a hard one here for anybody to be able to even, no one's even really suspecting it. Even harder if you wanted to prove it. So on with the story with George. He collects the life insurance and he goes back to Bristol. Now that's where Edith is, remember? So by 1914, he has 6 wives who are alive, but he has 2 wives who are dead, and he's squandered pretty much all of the money that he got from their life insurance. World War I was beginning at the same time, and he manages to avoid becoming a soldier. He now meets Margaret Lofty. So he charms Margaret, and 1 month into their relationship, they marry. It's the same routine. Margaret's the same kind of vulnerable woman. He preys upon her. They marry very quickly. She writes a letter to her family saying she's fallen in love with the most amazing man. She takes out a life insurance policy. By this point, he's going by the name of John Lloyd. So they marry. They go to Highgate in London for their honeymoon. He chooses the place to stay because it has, you guessed it, a bath. One day after their marriage, one day, Margaret is found dead in the bath. Now, you might be thinking, why was... Okay, so each case has happened in a different town. It's not as if the same doctor is ever coming out to see these women who are dead in the bath. So each one is just completely independent of each other. But nobody at any point was asking for an alibi either. Where might he have been? Why was he not there to stop the drowning? Where was he, etc.? But he had a really good alibi for each of the deaths. So in the case of the first one, Bessie, he'd gone out to buy fish. In the case of the second one, Alice, he'd gone out to buy bread. And in the case of Margaret, he'd gone out to buy tomatoes. So, I mean, those are great, aren't they? Those are absolutely fucking solid alibis. However, joking aside, this is where it all changes for George. A newspaper picks up the story. Because this third death happened in London, a national newspaper picked it up. So far, only local newspapers had reported Bessie and Alice, and kind of without much fanfare, which is a real shame for them. But that's how it was. Just really local newspapers picked it up. But now a national newspaper, the News of the World, which you might be familiar with. It's the Rupert Murdoch newspaper, now closed down. So they run this story, and something starts to click in people's heads. Alice, the second wife, her father, he sees this in the national newspaper, and he thinks, hang on, that's the way my daughter died. She died in a bath. That's the exact same thing. Then, and this is crazy, Arthur Conan Doyle gets involved, the famous Sherlock Holmes writer. He's living in London. He reads the newspaper. He gets involved, and he thinks something is very odd about this woman who died in the bath. And he starts searching around the local newspapers, and he finds the other two stories of the first two wives. So he goes to police and he says, I'm really suspicious about this. Something is very not right about the fact that we have 3 deaths. Same man there. Each time, all 3 drowned in a bath. So, Smith is waiting and he's waiting and he's waiting for this life insurance from the third wife to arrive. And it's not arriving. And he's getting really agitated at this point that this money is not coming through. London police are now heavily involved in this story, but George has no idea that the police are involved. He has not a clue that that's going on. He's just pacing up and down, waiting for this money. But they make sure he doesn't get the payment. They just don't let him know that he's being watched. At this point, they bring in Detective Inspector Neil. Now, he's brought in to head up the case. D.I. Neil works hard to try and pull all of the information together. He talks to 150 people, he visits 40 towns, and he finds that George Joseph Smith has 120 different bank accounts all across the country, all in different names. So, in 1916, still waiting for the insurance payout that was never going to come, he is arrested. He says, it's the irony of fate that all my wives died in the same way. I have nothing to do with it. The fact that all 3 of them drowned, nothing to do with it. It's just the irony of fate. Yeah, right, mate. Whatever. So the next and final character that we need to know about in this story is a man called Spilsbury. He was a pathologist, a very high profile pathologist at this time. Now, he was a well-known doctor, but also a cocky fuck. I mean, he liked to let people know that he was incredibly intelligent and that he probably knew more than they did. And in a courtroom, he would, he'd be very powerful at getting his opinions across. Juries tended to believe everything that this man had to say. Although, I'm not taking away from the fact that Spilsbury was actually very good at his job. He was a trailblazer for pathology and the kind of work that he did. He would do miraculous work to discover the cause of death. And so he looks at the case and he says, okay, I want to exhume Bessie's body. So the first wife, the first to drown, he wants to bring her body back. There was a dry patch on Bessie's thigh, which was covered with goosebumps. And Spilsbury determines that this means that at the moment when she was drowning, her body went into shock. So her body wasn't used to the water filling her lungs. It wasn't a slow process, that it happened quickly because a patch of skin on her thigh had risen at a really high speed. So if at this point, like me, when you're hearing this story, you're thinking, well, it's so obvious that he drowned these women. Remember what I said earlier on about it's really hard to prove that someone has actually been drowned. So Spilsbury creates an entirely crazy and fucked up experiment, but it's brilliant. So he gets a bath of water, he gets a volunteer. Who the fuck is volunteering to do this experiment? I don't know. She's described as, in the documentary, she's described as a very fine lady swimmer. And that's obviously terminology of the time. The language in this documentary at points is hilarious. A very fine lady swimmer. So what does your wife do? She's a very fine lady swimmer. Oh, great. So, in my head, this is how it went. George was pushing these women's heads under the water to drown them. But no. Spilsbury discovers something else through his experiment. So for weeks, he ponders over the bathtubs and the victim's measurements. And he experiments with a million ways to drown someone without leaving a single mark on their body. He goes back to Dr. French, if you remember, he was the one that looked at Bessie. He goes back to Dr. French's description of how she was found in the bathtub. And Spilsbury reasons that Smith, under the pretense of teasing Bessie's feet in a loving manner, must have seized Bessie by the feet and suddenly pulled them up towards himself, sliding the upper part of the body under the water. The sudden flood of water into her nose and her throat would cause shock and a sudden loss of consciousness. This would explain the absence of any injuries and the fairly minimal signs of drowning. So the idea being he would go to the edge of the bath and he would be touching their feet, possibly massaging them, possibly in a sexual manner, and then he would grab their feet really quickly, basically forcing the top end of the body underneath the water. Now, there is actually footage of this being tried online, and it is really horrible to watch because, as simple as it sounds, what you realise is that actually, see, once the legs are pulled up like that, it is impossible for the person who's under the water to have any kind of mobility. At that point, they just cannot get up. They lose all, they can thrash and they can try and move, but they are not going to ever be able to physically raise the top half of their body and get out underwater. So Spilsbury, having arrived at this theory, decides he is going to have to actually carry out this experiment and demonstrate it. So he gets the very fine lady swimmer, and unfortunately she nearly drowns during the experiment. I mean, fuck's sake, they're able to revive her. Thank God she was actually revived. I bet she wasn't in a rush to volunteer to help with any any of his experiments in the future. So the fact that she nearly actually drowned this volunteer, it proves that actually this is how Smith was able to do it without leaving a mark on the women's bodies. Now, these days, such experiments are banned. Of course they are, thank God. So, on June 22nd, 1917, he stands in a court charged with the death of Bessie. The papers have gone absolutely nuts about the story at this time. It gets discussed that he's one of the very earliest sort of serial killer celebrity types. You know, the sort of like, you know, we see that a lot with like, Ted Bundy, all women were like turning up at the, you know, court because they were in love with them. But yeah, George had a similar appeal. Women were still drawn to him, even though he was accused of murder. So they didn't really have a great deal of hard evidence. They had a way that they thought he'd done it, but they didn't really have any massively hard proof. At this time in British courts, you weren't allowed to bring in any other deaths that were connected to the person that you were trying. So this trial was purely about Bessie, not the other two wives. However, the judge made a huge decision, a decision which changed the system of law in the UK radically. He allowed the other two deaths to be brought into evidence. I mean, George Smith was outraged at this idea. It had never happened before, and he could not believe that these other two deaths were being brought in to the same case. So it had gone from he's being tried for Bessie's death to he's now being tried for 3 separate deaths. 112 witnesses were called. Dr. Spilsbury, Bathman, was brought into court and he went mega theatrical with his presentation. He brought a bath into the courtroom and he presented the science. He demonstrated the leg pulling. He demonstrated how a person would drown without any marks on their body and said, this is how George Joseph Smith managed to do this. So his testimony was absolutely vital. The authority that he brought was really convincing for the jury. The judge drew the case to a close and told the jury they must look at the 13 coincidences between these deaths and decide if this is death by design or just purely accidental coincidence. Smith jumped up in court and shouted at the judge, "You're telling them I killed them! You're telling them I killed them!" It took 22 minutes. The jury returned and he was sentenced to death by hanging. Now this case, it changed so many things in the world of trials and investigation because of Spilsbury bringing the bath into the court. This was new. This hadn't really been done before, and it changed how evidence could be presented. George Joseph Smith was executed by hanging, hung for the murder of 3 women. And so ends the story of George Joseph Smith. Okay, what do I love about this story? I love the fact that this story actually was the first time that someone had actually brought something like a bath into a court, and that changed the way that we looked at things in the future and how evident. I mean, you look at things now, things are so theatrical in a court. I hate to always go back to it because actually I don't even find it that interesting a one, but the OJ glove moment, you know, the moment of does the glove fit? Oh, the glove doesn't fit him. Oh, all that moment. That was pretty theatrical. That was pretty big at that moment. And I'm sure there's a million other examples. I think it's interesting that it probably changed a lot more than just something to do with the justice system. I think it's really interesting that women at that time had absolutely no rights. They just weren't in charge of their own lives. It was men who were in charge of everything for them. And I think that, I'm not saying this case alone, but I'm saying this case would have been hopefully a factor that might have moved things forward slightly. Obviously women did a lot of the changing of that themselves. But I hope in some way this maybe played a small, even a little 1% change in it somewhere. Yeah, and as always, it's just a bit twisty, it's a bit turny, and it's a bit weird. It's got all the ingredients that I really like. It's got a liar, a sociopath, who ends up being a murderer. So yeah. Afterwards, after I had done all my research and put the story together, I read from 3 experts in 2017, and I just think they're talking absolute bollocks. But there's 3 people who will say, lawyers who will say, actually, there is room for massive questioning here. I'm not sure that he was definitely guilty. People were blinded by the pathology because it was new, because they'd never seen theatrics like that in a courtroom. So actually, this was a wrongful conviction, and he should never have been caught. I don't believe that. There's way too many things add up to make this a wrongful conviction. And yeah, so maybe he did stand up in court and shout, "You're telling them I'm guilty," or whatever it was that he said. But yeah, I think the judge was right. I think he was actually fucking guilty. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to get in touch with me, it would be lovely to hear from you. You can email me at extraordinarystoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you want to get in touch on Instagram or Facebook, it's Extraordinary Stories Podcast. If you want to go the Twitter road, it's at Extra Stories Pod. I'm always happy to hear from people. I would love to know what you're thinking out there. Any thoughts on this? Anything that you think that I didn't cover properly? Anything you'd like me to cover? Please just let me know. I'm really open to just hearing from people. It's nice to have some communication so far. So yeah, don't be a stranger. Get in touch. At this moment in time, I'm just kind of getting as many episodes out as possible. I will eventually fall into a rhythm where, hopefully each week I can be presenting a main story and then a small stories episode where I maybe cover 3 or 4, but in much smaller in much smaller ways. I don't know when that'll be, but yeah, for the moment, I hope you're enjoying the episodes that I'm putting out. Okay, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on. Let's do it. Let's get it over.